I'm live now. Okay, let's get started. Right. Good evening, viewers. I know you'll be populating very soon. I'm with Elliot again today. Elliot Febe, how are you?
I'm fine, Derek, and how are you?
I'm good, thank you very much. So we are discussing social justice, and food security. A book by Elliot Febe, a United Nations Global Challenge. Now, we've also been discussing Zimbabwe, My Home, My Frustration, Articles of Defiance. We finished that, so now we are moving on to this book, Social Justice and Food Security. And we think that social justice and food security is a very important subject to discuss. Some questions came up last week when we started with the introduction. We're moving on to chapter 1, but we started with the introduction, and there was the issue of genetically modified foods, or GMOs. Now, there were people asking questions as to whether Africa should be accepting these genetically modified foods. And I think it's good that Africa is beginning to ask those questions. But I hope that instead of just being skeptical and asking those questions, what we should actually be doing is making sure that we invest in our own research and development. We make our own research, and we make our own studies. We write our own papers, so that we know what exactly it means to have a genetically modified organism or a GMO foodstuff. For example, there are different ways in which GMOs have been made in the past. The first of which was actually called selective breeding. And selective breeding just means that you choose from what you have. You choose organisms which have the characteristics that you want, and you make sure that these organisms carry out the fertilization, so that what you have is a product with the characteristics of the things that you want out of that food. Okay, for an example I always give is that the maize that we eat in Zimbabwe, for example, I know it's a staple food, but it was not always a staple food. It was actually imported from outside Zimbabwe. I think it was imported from America. And at the time when you look at it now, and the cob is a full cob, but what you realize is that before it was a full cob with many seed grains, it almost looked like a grain of rice. Okay, so that's what it looked like. The old maize plant was actually, it almost looked like rice. It was very different from what it is now. Okay, so we need to understand selective breeding. We need to understand genetically modified foods and what it means. And basically, this is what it means from a scientific point of view. A genetically modified foodstuff is one in which the genetics of the plant or of the animal has been manipulated or engineered. We call it genetic engineering. So it has been manipulated to the extent that it's going to give out the characteristics that we want. In any event, what we're trying to do is to increase food production. Okay, and if you do the research, you'll find that most of the foods that we buy in shops, even though they are written that they are natural foods, actually are not natural foods. Okay, because that's what the Industrial Revolution was all about. The Industrial Revolution was in fact, the agricultural revolution, to start with, was about increasing food production to cater for people who were now concentrating or living in urban areas. Okay, so there was a huge population increase in urban areas, and which led to the agricultural revolution, because they needed, especially in Europe. In Africa, there was no rush for an agricultural revolution, and the reason there was no rush was because naturally we were able to get food. Okay, we were able to get food naturally from the environment, so there was no need for mass production. and we were always living in small groups and scattered across the continent. So there was no need for mass production, which led to, maybe that's why we didn't have an agricultural revolution. Okay, we're just using natural methods of farming. But in Europe, there was need for that. Okay, and when you need to do a lot of, when you need to produce a lot of food, what happens is you end up having to manipulate, okay, some of these foodstuffs so that they produce the maximum. Okay, the only problem that I see with importing or accepting genetically modified food is that we don't know how they are going to impact the natural environment that we already have. So how will GMO seeds, for example, impact on the natural seeds or natural in quotes, because most of those seeds are natural now, but before that they were probably a different plant altogether, but which has been modified genetically. Okay, so the impact of the environment is where my worry is. But to explain genetic engineering just briefly, okay, for people who are not scientists, to explain genetic engineering, it's going into the nucleus of an organism, like a plant or an animal, and then manipulating the genes, okay, so that so that you begin to get a plant or an animal which has the characteristics that you want, because the one which is there is either not producing enough, okay, to be a foodstuff which is available or which is enough for the population. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to increase production, and to increase production and maybe increase the size. For example, chicken, okay? You can genetically modify chicken so that you've got more meat on the bones than the original chicken, okay? But obviously there's an impact on the animals. And so far, scientifically, there's been no adverse effects, okay, on food, on those people who have consumed this food, okay? But we don't know what the long-term effects are. That's why I'm saying, as Africans, we should also be doing our own research, okay, before we accept these foods, or as we're accepting this food, let's do our own research and development. And I call upon the governments, African governments, to invest in science and technology, because I think we are missing in that sphere. We're not investing in science and technology. And if we don't invest in science and technology, then we have to rely on the products from other countries or who have done the research. They probably know if there are any adverse effects, they know about them. But we don't know about them because we're not doing the research. So that's, if there are any questions concerning that, I can explain it a bit more, okay, from a scientific point of view. But should we accept these foods are in our supermarkets here in Europe anyway? So everyone is eating GMOs, and there's been no scientific evidence to show, because scientists will work with evidence. So far, there's no scientific evidence to suggest that it's bad for us. But that does not stop us doing our own research instead of relying on the research of other people. Have you got any comments on that, or any question?
Yeah, indeed. In this book, I also talked about GMO, which genetically modified organisms.
Yeah.
I know from a developing world point of view, the moment you start talking about GMOs, they actually sort of associate it with obesity in the United States, where it is fully supported by the government. However, Zimbabweans, I know there were some questions last week with regards to the threat of indigenous seeds in Zimbabwe with the coming of GMO seeds.
Yeah.
But let me also remind our viewers, Zimbabweans out there, that Zimbabwe has been using GMO seeds for a long time, actually since 1940s.
Yeah.
Seedco, for example, the seeds that we buy from Seedco
are GMO already.
From, we remember the R201, drought-resistant seeds, R215, all those were genetically modified.
So being drought resistant means that it has been genetically modified, so that it can thrive in a place where drought is a problem.
Indeed.
You see.
So currently, yes, I think you find even it has moved from the Sitco has moved from the R201, R215. Now we've got the SC43, SC47, SC411, scientifically modified seeds. And all these, some of them, like the 403, very specific, drought resistant, early maturity, all that the seeds have been modified to give it that characteristics.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes seeds are modified to be disease resistant.
Yeah. Especially in Africa, where you've got a lot of diseases attacking the plants.
Indeed. So yes, from time to time, we experience pests which become so resistant to non-chemical science and technology. We are able to genetically modify the seeds to be able to withstand those new pesticides, new pests. So yes, so these
Can I quickly answer a question from Tendai?
Okay.
He wants me to define genetic modification, and he's also asking if it's the same as a hybrid. Now, the term hybrid is used for plants which have been genetically modified. Now, the difference between a genetically modified plant and a plant which has undergone what do you call it? There's another method where naturally you take the plants, okay, and it's almost more natural than genetic modification. But genetic modification it's a more precise method, okay, where you're actually going straight into the DNA and making those changes, okay. Whereas with the hybrids, it could be that you've just taken a plant with the characteristics that you want and another plant with the characteristics that you want, and then you pair them together and you get something which is a hybrid. But with genetic modification, you are being more precise. Okay, you are going straight into the genes, and you are turning on and off some chromosomes just to ensure that you get the GMO that you want. So the problem with genetic modification is that it has people asking more questions because it is more like an immediate result that you get after you've done the manipulation. Whereas with the hybrid, they can take time because you are trying to use natural means of just taking two plants and cross-pollinating them together, so that what you get is something which appears more natural. But with genetic modification, you are just taking a plant and going straight into the nucleus, and you are modifying the genes, you are modifying the chromosomes inside the genes, so that you get a certain characteristic that you want. Okay.
Yeah, and also what's there in terms of GMO is got actually a different type of variants. It's not one form. So yes, this is why you find it can be engineered in plants. It can be engineered in animals, for example. So yes, there is also modifications that have got traditional characteristics, and I think this is what has always been the case, especially with seeds in developing worlds and indeed in various parts of the world, even here in the UK. UK itself, because it's bound by the EU laws.
Yeah.
You you'll find that there's that suspicion of GMO food and also GMO seeds in a way. Yeah. But yes, they have got GMO seeds that they use here. The modification it's a different variant than the modification as we know it from the United States, because they do it specifically for mass production. Yeah. And other countries, they do it either to counter the new pests or to make the crops drought resistant, or sometimes it's just to increase production in a way, but without a complete altering the DNA of the plants themselves.
Yeah.
So yes, and the question I think was whether our traditional crops are under threat from GMO. Of course, there is always a risk.
There is, yeah. That's why our scientists need to be looking into. They should be studying and looking at the potential risk, and also collecting around for some time now. We should be having a wealth of evidence now. So they have not affected the local plant.
And whilst there, I think even the United Nations have accepted that the need for GMO. And the United Nations again is sort of, it has always proceeded with care in the sense that it doesn't want to be seen to encourage GMO. Also, it doesn't want to be seen to discourage GMO.
Yeah.
But we saw the last Sustainable Development Summit, which was in Paris, the Article 20. And here I'm talking about the year started April 2016 and to end April 2017. 133 countries so far out of the 197 have ratified. You'll be surprised that Zimbabwe is not ratified. We are about a month left and they've not ratified. Here is a situation whereby those countries which would have ratified will be supported in terms of financially, in terms of science and technology to innovate so that can increase production and meet the quotas for their own national consumption and exports. But you would expect that a country like Zimbabwe, whereby we are now net importer of food because of shambolic land redistribution or invasion, call it whatever, by any means, but it is a land invasion in itself. You would expect that the Zimbabwe would embrace in its entirety the need for support from the United Nations, developed world, for innovation, science, mechanization, which comes with the ratification of the Article 20 of UN. Zimbabwe, up to now, has not ratified it. They signed on the day an intention to ratify, but that was it. Up to now, they've not ratified. It means we have 30 days now left, less than 30 days. And I think it is at the end of their queue, especially given this.
What are the benefits?
There's also technical cooperation, integrated technical cooperation at a global level. There's an organization which falls under UN called CSD, which is Commission for Sustainable Development. So they've got a budget to assist countries in terms of technical cooperation, in terms of funding. And so, yes, we, by not ratifying, it means we've not accepted the support or technical cooperation within a global knot. So, which is, you would expect that any country would do that. There's no punitive measure where you might decide to say, well, maybe there's so much money that that country has to pay to United Nations. Instead, they will receive technical assistance for free. So we are saying, from a Zimbabwean perspective, that we don't need that technical assistance from developed world. We would expect that this is payback for the developed world to assist developing world.
Now let's get into the book. Is there any pending question you want to address, or shall we get straight into chapter 1?
No, I think we have addressed the GMO, which yes. So that's far on my screen. I think people are listening.
Yeah, I think they're still.
Then I'll pick the question.
Right. So in chapter 1, you pick on some of the promises made. It's chapter 1 of this book, by the way. Can you lift your copy? So it's chapter 1 of Social Justice and Food Security, a book written by Elliot Febvre, a United Nations global challenge. So it's global in its nature because food security should really worry. I think every country of the world should be worried about food security. So in chapter 1, you challenge some of the promises made at the summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil towards sustainable development and public awareness. So there were commitments made such as voluntary commissions on food security and sustainable development. Commitment 1 was deploying nature-based solutions to global challenges in climate, food, and development for a sustainable future. Commitment 2, increase of food and agricultural production. And then commitment 3, pleading to give African soils the right place in the future we want.
Yes.
So you looked at these commitments and you had misgivings about their achievement.
The theme of the Rio 20, which was in 2012, it says the future we want. You would expect that such a theme would carry an international mandate by the United Nations to closely police and monitor the smart targets. Greenhouse emissions. But what do we get? 4 commitments that they came up with.
Yeah.
And those attacked the United Nations was actually, they were termed voluntary commitments. Now, what does that mean? It means that the countries who attended or who signed the commitments, sort of control mechanism to monitor whether those countries would meet commitments. So that was my order. I think I did clearly to say I would have expected that the United Nations itself would have turned those commitments into smart targets, given the seriousness of the nature of those commitments, especially in terms of agricultural production using innovation, mechanization, and research. And that was said to be a voluntary act. You know, to me, the language, with good intent, of course, the summit was in good intent, but I think the language used was flawed.
Don't you think that they are limited in terms of policing any sort of commitments that they might make? Because ultimately it's the responsibility of individual countries to ensure food security, even in a globalized economy in which even developed countries are also relying on third world countries to produce some of the food that can be consumed here. Do you think it's just like advisory and it's difficult to police or to enforce? And it's up to individual governments to ensure their own food security.
Yes, I think before I comment on your question, I would like to acknowledge, I think I've got new viewers who have just joined, Kelly, David, and Wellington. Welcome, guys. Right. Yes,
Can you quickly tell them what we're discussing?
Yes.
They've just joined.
Today we are reviewing the book, Social Justice and Food Security, a UN Global Challenge. A global perspective of food security. And currently we are looking at the previous summit that was in 2004 commitments that were agreed upon by the heads of state. And these were termed voluntary commitments. And in this book, I evaluated, analyzed them, and I attacked the United Nations in terms of not coming with coherent action or program of action towards the implementation of those commitments. And actually the use of the word voluntary commitments, which left to the rogue elements to misinterpret
yes.
or to implement.
Yeah, so my question was, is the United Nations limited military commitment or policy that they
left it to the individual countries to make sure that there is sustainable development within their country and the provision of food within their country. But however, I disagree that the UN has no right to monitor or to police those countries. They've done that before. I can give you good examples. I think you are aware that we had MDGs. There were 8 MDGs. One of them was to cut poverty by half, global poverty. And because the United Nations themselves were able to fund some of the activities within the developing world, and also to support the governments in terms of coming up with coherent policies, the world was able to halve the number of poor people in terms of. So yes,
But was that through them funding the activities, or was it through? Was there a punishment for not achieving?
What they do is, you find within United Nations, they don't. There's no, carrot and stick approach. But what they do is, in terms of technical expertise, so for the countries that signed up to improve the lives of their people, they've got a budget. So yes, they've got a budget, and that budget, of course, there's some strings attached in terms of the United Nations itself engaging, giving that country technical expertise to implement those programs. So, and you saw those countries that actually embrace the MDGs, especially in terms of alleviating or mitigating poverty. They embrace the funding, they embrace the technical expertise, and they were able to improve the livelihood of their own people. So what I'm saying here, similarly in terms of food security, the United Nations has got the resources. It can leverage the resources. It has got a pool of experts. It can leverage those the expertise. And they've got periodic mechanism to control, to evaluate the impact of those policies. They also sort of give guidance to a policy framework or a global knot. This is why now we are talking about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17. So yes, in 2015, we came to the end of the 8 MDGs. Millennium Development Goals.
Yeah.
Now we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, every government itself, so the United Nations has set up a framework. Every government's policies have to align within those 17. Because each time they meet after the 4 years, they have to evaluate in terms of the success of those 17.
Yeah.
And governments have to report.
How long?
Sorry?
How long did the SDGs run for?
The SDGs will run for 15 years. So 2015 to 2030. So they are always given 15 years sort of a mandate. But in between, there are also some meetings to sort of evaluate as to how far governments have implemented.
Yeah.
And as we speak at the moment, 2015 was the end of the MDGs, and this is where they then have to launch. They launched last year in New York, the 17 SDGs. So there is a pool of money, and especially the United Nations have made it a policy. It's one of the SDGs anyway, that they will support the developing world. They will support the developing world in terms of technical expertise, in terms of the funding. But those countries need to make an initiative. And one of it is this COP21 of Paris Pact, where the governments are supposed to ratify Article 20 of the United Nations in terms of sustainable development and also mitigating global warming. And they were given 12 months, 1 year, to ratify. And the 1 year from April 2016 to April 2017. We are left with about 30 days. Zimbabwe has not ratified it. In not doing so, they refused technical expertise and funding to alleviate poverty.
Yeah, but I mean, when you look at commitments to maybe greenhouse gas emission reductions, these have been going on for years.
Yes.
In terms of asking countries to reduce their greenhouse emissions. But it also affects their industrial output in terms of not using fossil fuels in order to carry out their industrial activities. And we've only had America and China making a commitment only in Paris. And that was like 2 years ago before Obama left the presidency. So we've got big superpowers who are still worried about their own economic growth and development, not making commitments which will force them to reduce their greenhouse emissions because it affects their economy. And if it affects their economy, then it affects the person who is going to be voted into power. So it's difficult for countries to ratify or to get to sort of make commitments at a UN level, okay, to a situation in their own country. Is that not the case?
No, it's a different perspective altogether. Look at it. In terms of the parameters for mitigating global warming, the United Nations and the developed world, they are very aware that the developing world, as much as they want them to follow suit, they lack the financial and technical expertise. And that for your own information, the developing world is not being punished. In other words, what we have seen so far from the United Nations is to declare that the developed world, who are the greatest polluters, must fund innovation in the developing world. So this is why the United Nations has not come down on the developing world to say stop using fossil fuel. They've not done that. Or what they have done is that as technology and innovation is introduced, with this green energy, gradually those countries will actually depart from using the fossil fuel.
But at the same time, do you know that the developing world, even America itself, they are still using fossil fuels?
Indeed.
And what Trump has done since coming into office is he has removed the requirement for companies to send in a report. I think it's a monthly or whatever frequency they are sending the reports in, but they have to report to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and tell them how much emissions they are producing. I think as part of evaluating the state of greenhouse gas emissions in the country, and also to inform how they react to, for example, the Paris Agreement, in which finally America and China, they signed up to it, but I think Trump is planning to pull out of that agreement, which was a landmark because we're looking at developed countries. These guys are already developed,
Yeah.
but they still want to pollute the environment. They still don't want to be held accountable to greenhouse emissions. So they are polluting the environment at the same time that we're asking the entire world and even some underdeveloped countries have made commitments to reduce emissions and to stop using to stop emitting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
Yeah, I think yes. Look at it. My view about so far the policies of President Donald Trump, is that I think in fair comment and evaluation, his policies of late are actually a threat to internationalization, to globalization, and also to the efforts that have been taken for the past 30 or 40 years in terms of mitigating global warming. Look at it. And it is also in violation of SDG 13, number 13, which says every country globally have to commit in arresting, mitigating climate change, global warming. And the America did sign for it, and it's actually part of the Paris Pact. Now, by saying that, if you look at Donald Trump, he actually is sort of looking at global warming as a myth, as a conspiracy by scientists.
Yeah, so I mean, if he does not believe that it's real, it's going to be difficult for America to sign up or to make commitments in reducing greenhouse gas emissions at a time when he's a president who has come in, but as a business person, I think he has a lot of connections in business circles. So he's someone who is there to protect his business partners or his business, the business community in America. So telling them to cut out fossil fuels altogether is something which might affect. And also, China is surging ahead economically, and China has been polluting the environment. It's in Beijing, for example. Some days people cannot even go outside because of the gas emissions there, because of the pollution in the atmosphere. So you find that America may have just realized that they are shooting themselves in the foot in terms of economic growth and development by saying, oh, we are not going to use fossil fuels, when at the same time China is going ahead and using fossil fuels, and it's helping them with economic growth and development, and it's now hurting America. And we know that in terms of power, or global power these days, the economy plays a big part. So the country with the biggest GDP, for example, or the country with the highest growth okay, is viewed as the country which is the most developed, and that goes on to status as a world leader, and China has been catching up. So could it be the case that the Americans have realized that maybe it's too early to say let's stop using fossil fuels, and maybe it's just a lie by Donald Trump that he doesn't believe in the effects in human beings affecting the environment and causing climate change.
I agree that this is a consensus in the United States of America. Remember, America got intellectual capital. They've got all these scientists. They've got they know they've got empirical evidence for how human beings through greed have caused global warming. That they know. But what we are talking about is not necessarily a national consensus. It is a perception of Donald Trump. Unfortunately, Donald Trump has had this perspective long before he became the president of the United States. And this is exactly this was his campaign trump card. That he's coming as an anti-establishment, and therefore he will rip through all those treaties that were previously signed or agreed upon by previous president. So yes, so it's not a consensus from the United States.
Yeah, but now the problem is that it might not be a consensus, and the scientists are very clear about the effects of human activities on climate change and global warming. But the problem now is that of authority or a position of influence, let's say influence, because he's not very authoritative at the moment, but he holds a position of influence, and he's always on Twitter tweeting all these things, and if he's repeating the same lies all the time, okay, he's already planted some doubts. I mean, some people will say, look, if the seeds of doubt are coming from a person who is very close to these scientists anyway, could it be true what he's saying? Could the scientists really be cooking these things, just maybe to benefit some people? So we've got Donald Trump now, who is sowing seeds of mistrust, in the scientific community, or in our reliance on science and our trust in science, that whatever the scientists are saying is probably true, and it's helping us to make decisions for the future. Now, if Trump is saying it, some people, those who are not scientifically literate, they'll begin to believe they'll begin to doubt some of the scientific evidence because Donald Trump is doubting it.
I'm glad that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. That's a temporal position. He will be lucky to complete one term. By miracle, maybe he might extend 2 terms, which will be 10 years.
Yeah.
Right? Mind you, USA is what it is because of globalization. And it is what it is because of internationalization. But here is Donald Trump coming in and ripping into pieces what humanity has built over 100 years. And turning now United States into his own fiefdom. He is now nationalized. He is now got a national agenda. America first. We've seen that. Yes, we've seen, and the same we saw that as well from in the UK. We've got Brexit. There is now a drift from globalization, a drift from a global unity. And I see that, where we are heading, already we've seen that there is now total mistrust between nations. And we'll go back in history where there will always be warring factions. There will always be warring factions. Because by globalization, internationalization, having all these pacts, we managed to foster peace and stability globally. Now, the moment we then withdraw from these pact unions, and the way President Donald Trump is saying, we sort of reignite the mistrust and the old wounds who resurface. And I think it is a pity that we are trying to destroy what humanity have built over 100 years.
There was some commentary that what Donald Trump is failing to harness is the soft power, and also the UK in terms of their Brexit. They are now failing to harness the soft power which has been built over more than 50 years after the Second World War. And by calling on or by disrupting everything which has been taking place, or the build up to 2016, what is done is he has failed, and is probably contemplating military action in some places, blind right-wing politics, which is what brought us into first especially Second World War in the first place. So yeah. I think you're right to say that he's probably not helping the peace which has ensued over. I mean, since Second World War, we've not really had any major wars, and there's always been fear that there might be a Third World War, especially during the Cold War. But as soon as Russia disintegrated, there was relative peace. And whatever wars have been fought are nothing compared to what... in fact, I think people are dying more from obesity and diseases caused by sugar, diabetes and stuff like that. That's what we're dying more from, diseases caused by living large or living well than from actual wars which are being fought in pockets like the Middle East.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yes, I think the world has every reason to be worried by the new political dynamism sweeping through continents, continental, of new breed of politicians who want to reinvent nationalistic agenda, ripping all treaties that have ensured peace and stability globally, and that will unsettle, the balance of power globally. And I can see that igniting the, wars, and that is very much worrying. Yeah.
Right. So. Let's see. We talked about agriculture.
Yes.
The United Nations has placed agriculture as one thematic area in need of international and regional coordination.
Yes.
And you have the CSD Chapter 14 of Agenda 21. According to the same report, 83% of the expected global population of 8.5 billion will be living in developing countries. So, in other words, if 83% of the 8.5 billion will be living in developing countries, then we're looking at developing countries as needing to really take food security more seriously, because it's something which food security or insecurity is something which can cause major conflict in most places.
Especially if you look at Africa. Africa, we've got 1.03 billion people. It's a vast continent. It's actually the biggest continent by any means. Again, a continent with oil, with the virgin resources, untapped resources. It has the capacity to feed the entire globe, but it is unable to feed only 1 billion people. Mind you, we've got 7 billion people in the world.
Yes.
And Africa's capacity in terms of the resources has the capacity to feed 7 billion people.
But are we saying we're not growing enough, or we are growing but exporting too much?
The problem that we have in Africa is that it's all the above. So firstly, we are still using traditional means of production, with the hectareage production per hectare is very low because we are not mechanized. So this is where we.
But is that the case in every African country, or is it just Zimbabwe?
No, it's not. It's not only Zimbabwe. It's the case in every African country, although the scale differs. If you go to countries like South Africa, we have got commercial farmers who were not disturbed after the transition. Yes, they are mechanized, and the production is still high. They're able to feed the nation and export. That's fine. But even in South Africa, if you go to the rural areas, the ordinary people in South Africa in the rural areas, they still depend on traditional tools. They still depend on traditional seeds and varieties.
But in terms of Zimbabwe, I've heard some people commenting that actually, if you look at food production or maize production, even when we had full-fledged commercial farming, the bulk of the maize was still being produced by the peasant farmers. So if you look at the what you call the national granary, the GMB in Zimbabwe was getting more maize from the peasant farmers than from the actual commercial farmers, because the commercial farmers were more interested in other cash crops such as tobacco.
I agree. I think there was that trend after 1980 that the rural population was somehow empowered, but it was more of being motivated because they were able to, for the first time, they were able to grow maize and sell it to the GMB and to have a disposable income. So it motivated a lot of people in the rural areas to start producing for the market, for the GMB. And because they were being paid good money there. Yeah. But however, the commercial sector continued to produce the highest in terms of product per hectare. Of course, the commercial areas, because of mechanization, because of manpower and funding, they were producing more. But whatever the commercial farmers were producing, this was also exported. So we had EU quotas for beef. We were also exporting in terms of grain, tobacco, etc., which were the cash crops the commercial farmers were doing. So although the commercial farmers' produce were being exported, the local farmers in the rural areas were able then to produce enough to feed the nation. So there was that gap was being filled by local farmers. Yeah. Now what we have is now that commercial bracket has now collapsed because of land invasion and the shambling land redistribution. So now what we have is we have only the rural peasant farmers producing the grain for consumption and also for export. Yes, in certain instances, we are even exporting outside the country when we don't have enough to feed ourselves. And that is you don't blame the farmers
because we want forex.
You can only blame the policies of the government.
Yeah.
You can only blame the policy of the government because it is up to the government to come up with coherent policies
Yeah.
That actually motivates people from selling to the government, in this case the GMB. And mind you, they are still selling to GMB, but most of them, they are selling at a loss. And some have discontinued producing maize in favor of other cash crops like cotton, tobacco, etc. And by so doing, the hectare of maize have been reduced.
It's reduced, yeah.
Yes. So, for example, we don't pay good prices for our staple food. We continue to have problems. And this is not necessarily peculiar to Zimbabwe, but this is across the entire African continent.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at the Rio 2012 commitments, there was a commitment for integration, innovation of agro industry. You know, technical expertise from the United Nations, which and by so doing, the United Nations itself did come up with policies or sort of commitments, as they called them, to try to encourage governments to come up with policies that actually sort of mechanize or give priority to agricultural production, agricultural innovation, mechanization, coming up with innovation in terms of the technology to increase production and address the issues of food security within member states.
Okay. So one of the things that a country needs in order to ensure food security, sustainable development, is the issue of energy provision.
Yes.
Sometimes I look at countries like Spain, and I think Spain is doing much better in terms of generating, because they've got the technology, but they're doing much better at generating solar energy, for example, when compared to most African countries. Now, do you think that African governments are doing enough to ensure that there is enough energy or energy generation on the continent? There is a famous picture of a map, the globe, and you'll find that places like Europe and America are well lit up on the map. But if you look at Africa, it goes to show it as the dark continent that we come to associate with Africa. So what can we do as African countries to ensure energy security? I know we're talking about food security, but we need energy security as well.
I think in this book also I looked at energy.
Yes, that's why I'm mentioning it. It's in chapter 1. So you looked at energy, you looked at the atmosphere, but I think we've covered the atmosphere already in terms of climate change and debunking the myth that people like Donald Trump are spreading in terms of putting a dent on the confidence on scientific evidence being produced. But what can Africans do, or how do you tackle the issue of energy in your book?
I think the way forward for African states is...
By the way, those who've just joined us, we're discussing Social Justice and Food Security by Elliot Feve, United Nations Global Challenge. So that's the book we're discussing. We're on chapter 1 today. We looked at the introduction last week.
I think the first thing that African states need to do is to, first of all, to review in terms of our capacity, and also with regard to our resources. Yes, due to technology, you find that green energy like solar, the prices of solar energy generation has come down because of technology and mass production, especially also from China, United States, and other European countries as well, and also India. So we are saying Africa we are lucky that on average we've got 12 hours sunlight. We can harvest. So gone are the days we cannot get it. We cannot give an excuse.
Can I give you one astonishing statistic?
Go ahead.
In 1 hour of sunlight energy, okay, falling on Earth, just 1 hour. Okay, there is enough energy falling in 1 hour, okay, to sustain the entire globe for a whole year if we can capture the energy. But because our solar panels are not yet efficient enough to capture all that energy, we are still facing challenges. But like you've mentioned, there are improvements taking place in terms of the efficiency of the solar panels being made. And my dream for Africa is to start with, to just have one solar panel per household, just one. And if China can provide cheap solar panels, or if we can make our own, what's so difficult about making a solar panel? I'm sure we could at least light all the households with just one solar panel per household.
So yes, in terms of Africa, African governments need to come up with coherent policies, especially for green energy. Not because we have to subscribe to mitigating global warming, but because that's a free resource that we have in abundance in Africa. Thanks, as I've said, to technology, the prices of solar panels have gone down. And if you look at what is happening in West Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, those countries are investing so much in solar power. Now they've got solar power farms. I remember shortly about 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to somebody in Kenya, and they invited me to see some of the developments that they are doing. Somebody in government. So yes, and where we have got countries that are at peace and which have changed governments positively, democratic manner, they've injected new ideas, new leadership has come up with new ideas, and globalization, innovation, and they're improving the lives of their own people. And this is exactly what Zimbabwe should be doing.
Yeah.
But instead, what we have, here we are. We are stuck with a 93-year-old president. The party is imploding, and he is not letting go, and he has done virtually nothing.
I think in terms of
power.
I think in terms of solar farms, for example, Elon Musk has come up with a tile. Has come up with a solar panel which is the size of a tile. So you could tile your entire rooftop, okay, with solar panels which look like normal tiles. Okay, because is that they occupy a lot of space, which could be used for other things like farming. So to protect those places where we can do farming and maybe other projects, what we can do is we can have those tile-style solar panels, or just put solar panels on every roof. They don't have to look like tiles. And that way we've already got, they are covering space which has already been taken up by housing anyway. And then we can preserve the areas, other areas, instead of putting solar farms there.
And apart from solar,
can I just say also, I think it's Denmark or some other country which has managed for one day to power their entire energy needs just on solar. Yeah, that came out about a day or two ago. So we've got countries now which have the capacity to use solar for all their energy needs for at least one day. Okay.
And apart from solar, we can use wind power as well. We can use hydro. I know in Zimbabwe we've been using hydroelectric for a very long time. We inherited that from the Smith regime, and we are still using it, unfortunately, under capacity, because we have not rehabilitated and we have not been servicing the infrastructure. But we can, and a good example is Mozambique. Mozambique has turned Cabora Bus into a regional generation of electricity. They are actually exporting electricity from Cabora Bus to other neighboring countries. At one point, Zimbabwe was also importing from Cabora Bus. They only stopped it because we failed to pay for the bills. So yes.
I don't know if it's true, but I also heard at one point when Zimbabwe was undergoing massive electricity cuts, they were actually exporting some of the electricity to get a bit of foreign currency at the expense of the local consumption. So some of those power cuts were not because we had no capacity, but because we were actually exporting. I don't know how far true that is.
I don't think there's truth on that, in the sense that, because we ended up we also imported electricity from Namibia. Also, apart from Mozambique, well, after Mozambique stopped supplying us, we also started importing from Namibia. We started importing from South Africa.
With the dead industry, which was no longer using that electricity.
Yes.
Why are we eating our own local consumption?
I think there is also, in terms of efficiency transmission, because we are still using infrastructure that is archaic and old. Since 1980, there have not been any major infrastructure to talk about,
except houses
in Zimbabwe. So yes,
except mansions.
Yes, and much of the electricity is actually lost in transmission.
Yeah.
So yes, we've got that, and again, there are also some mines using very old equipment.
Yeah.
That are energy intensive. So yes, you've got that also, and mind you, Kariba Dam, the hydroelectric generation at Kariba, much of the infrastructure at one point was down because of brain drain, and also because Zimbabwe couldn't even afford spare parts. And I think there was one story where an engineer was using some condoms to repair the machinery where they needed some valves.
Yeah.
And so yes, it's very pathetic. And
was that innovation?
I would say that was innovation, because this person decided, well, I just need a rubber valve. Right?
Excuse me.
For this machine to work.
But when we look at in terms of a country's economy, I think we need to bear in mind that energy is, the countries which produce the most energy are also the most developed, because there is nothing that you can do without energy. So if we're not investing in energy, then we're not investing in anything else. There's no point investing in other things when you don't have the energy, because just to charge mobile phones, just to have lighting in the houses, just to have industries running, there are a lot of industrial processes which require the use of energy. So the more energy we can control, the more energy we can harness, the better we can improve economic growth and development.
Yeah, I think maybe Derek, you agree with me that maybe we can then leave for chapter 2 next weekend.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. So
again, thank you, our viewers out there. I know the debate continues since this video will be available on the Facebook, and we are going also to put it on YouTube. Feel free to post your comments and any questions. I will be monitoring it, and we'll be discussing with you throughout until next Sunday we meet. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Chris Fungai, just joined us. I want to thank Brighton. Brighton about Bond Notes. I know you are a fan. Chris, Wadzi, Wiseman, Zondi, Bernard, Batsi, Jonathan, Marvin, Tendai, Meg Ropafadzo. Thank you guys, for watching. I will see you again next week. Kanisio.